and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Daisy, and she's going to talk to us about why she decided to quit teaching high school mid-year. But before we get there, I would love to know, why did you originally want to become a teacher?
So I actually was on the pre-law track in undergraduate school, but I decided that wasn't for me. And then after I graduated, I moved to Australia. I was like, oh, I'm just going to work a little bit. And then I ended up enrolling in a master's of secondary education. And that's how I ended up in teaching. And then also I've always loved history and social studies. Those were always my favorite subjects. So I was like, you know what? Let me try this. Yeah.
Awesome. And did you end up feeling like your teacher education program in Australia prepared you for what you would experience in America?
No. There's something unique about American society that makes us so different from the rest of the world, especially when it comes to education. No country is perfect with their education system. They have the same problems that we have, but they just manage them better. And also, I one thing that really stuck out to me, that anti-intellectualism has taken over in America and it hasn't in Australia. Like, I was in classrooms with students from all over the world, and everyone is deeply invested in their child's education. And you still get some parents who can be kind of tough to deal with, but at the end of the day, they want their child to succeed academically. And I feel like here in America, parents parents are out of control. I don't know what American parents think education is. I feel like they think it's, well, the teacher is responsible for everything for my child. Whereas in Australia, they're like, no, you're responsible for teaching my child and helping them succeed academically.
That makes sense. And we've been talking a lot on this channel about some of the kind of odd educational trends that are taking over, at least here in America. And a lot of teachers have really felt like they're being forced to almost be therapists with a lot of the new ideologies and social emotional learning and all of those things. I was curious, did you encounter that once you started teaching here in America? And what was that like?
Yes, and it was terrible. And for the students, for everyone involved, because I just feel like some students need therapy. They need psychologists, they need psychiatrists, they need counselors. And as a teacher, and this is another reason why I may not teach in America again. I'm not responsible for your emotional well-being, and having the expectation that I should be able to manage your child's mental health and be emotionally supportive. I feel like that's a tall task to ask of a teacher. And that's, for me, that's a personal boundary, because one, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to teach you history. And I'm concerned that with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they are so concerned about their identity and labels in a way that, like, some of them are trying to create a whole nother demographic based on how anxious they are. And there's a lot of buzzwords that are out there, and they don't understand what they are, and the adults in their life are not explaining to them. And I'm very cautious with Gen Z and Gen Alpha with the mental health, because I know years ago when I was in school, I graduated in 2011, mental health wasn't as big, but I still feel like we were resilient. Like, we went to school, we could overcome our challenges, we could persevere. I feel like with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're not built for it. And I don't want to call them soft. But there's something about them, like, they cannot overcome challenges. Personally, individual, like, they just can't. And I feel like they want you to always to emotionally coddle them, and they use their labels and identities and pronouns to avoid accountability.
Can you tell me more about that? Like any specific examples that
Oh
come to
my god.
mind?
I've had so many students who are like, "Well, I'm anxious this week, so I can't go to class." And it's like, "Well, you're still responsible for your work and showing up to learn." Or like, "Oh, I'm depressed, so I won't be at your class for like 2 weeks." That's not how the world works. Like, when you get out into the real world and you go to a job, you can't just tell your boss you're not showing up because you're anxious. And also, I think with them, because of their exposure via social media, like I said, they're trying to create this new identity. And then also using therapy terms when it comes to their academics, like diagnosing themselves with PTSD and all these, mental health disorders. And it's a very slippery slope. It is. It is.
Wow, that makes sense. And I think it's only increasing because I left the classroom in 2021. And I feel like now that we're into 2025, I'm sure even in that short period of time, from what
Mhm.
I'm hearing from other teachers, it's gotten so much worse. Now, you actually went through a situation with a student where you were told by your admin that you're not supporting this student enough. Can you kind of tell us about that situation?
So this student, like I said, they were going through a lot and I can imagine being that young and experiencing all those emotions, the identity and the transition. But with that being said, telling an adult that you can't accommodate my identity in the classroom, I think that's something that warrants their removal, because clearly you're not in an environment that can support your mental health, your transition, and all the things that come with that journey. And like I said, I'm very mindful of how I frame it. And obviously I want to support that student. But as a social studies teacher, I cannot help you navigate a transition from one gender to the next. I have no idea what it's like to be on all these medications at the same time and hormones. Like I could never imagine going through that. But with that being said, the expectation that I'm supposedly emotionally support you, I feel like I don't know, that's just something that shouldn't be asked of teachers, because that's a mental health issue, or some psychological issue that I don't even have the knowledge or the expertise to speak on, because that's not what I'm trained in. And simply saying you can't accommodate my identity, I feel like you should not be at this school, or you need to go and seek other services and resources in counseling to help you with that, because as your history teacher, I cannot help you. I can't.
And what were some of the things that either the student or parents or admin were asking you to do in that situation?
So this particular student, they were on like I forgot what it's called, like a plan where they could only attend classes on certain days. They could only go to certain activities. They could only do so much homework in a week. Their schedule was around their therapy and all of that, which I totally get. I'm fine with that. The problem was when you would try to hold them accountable for the academic part. It's like, well, I'm going through this, so I can't participate. I can't show up. I can't turn in my final exam. And then they engage in like avoidant behavior. And I felt like with that particular student, it was so much of the mental health took over with all of their diagnosis and their medications, in a way that as a teacher, at a certain point, I no longer wanted to deal with it.
And were you seeing these kind of challenges happening with other students? Did this start to become a more common thing?
Yeah, so everyone's exploring their identity, which is fine, but I felt like they were putting their identity with mental health. So they were attaching themselves to mental health issues just to say I have X, Y, and Z. And I found that very alarming, because there were students who actually did have mental health issues and were going through therapy and doing the best they can. And I completely understand that. But there were other students who they were just so eager to attach themselves to some identity or some mental health diagnosis. And I found that very alarming. Instead of like, so if you would see a student instead like, hey, I love, my name is such and such. I love soccer. I love to travel. They're like, hey, my name is this, and I have depression. I'm like, that's not how you introduce yourself to anyone. And like I say, you can acknowledge it, you can speak about it and be open about it, but it should not become your identity.
Interesting. And so I'm wondering, did you feel like the school was feeding into this, or do you feel
Yeah.
like it was more of like social media that they were pulling into the school environment?
So for the students, I felt like it was social media pulling into the environment. They were like, "Oh, this influencer has this," or "and so do I." And I was like, "That's kind of weird." And like I said, I try to be mindful how I frame this, and I could, as a millennial, I just couldn't understand attaching myself to someone else's identity or a diagnosis. And like I said, I find that very weird. But also the school policies of accommodating mental health was the school didn't realize they did not have the resources or the personnel to truly accommodate those with serious mental health issues. And so the responsibility was shifted to the teachers.
Wow.
Mhm.
And did you feel pressure to keep up with everybody's different identity? And did they get upset with you if you mislabeled them? How did all that end up working out?
Oh my, yes, absolutely. So I remember when I would write comments before I would write them for all my students, I had like a list because there were students that were not, and this is another thing, there were students who were out at the school, but not to their parents. So you had to be very careful in the pronouns, the names you use, and how you speak about them. And even to the point where I know some faculty were omitting certain pieces of information to the parents. And it got to a point where some faculty were lying to the parents. And I was very uncomfortable with that because it is not my place as a teacher to lie to these parents. It's not. And so the school had put teachers in that position. And I remember there was a student that was fully out at the school, but when parents came to visit, you had to address them by another name. And parents will have questions. Why is my child in counseling? And I cannot tell them why. And it's more of a, well, your child, so they're experiencing difficulties. And that's how I would have to frame it. But I'm like, your child's trans, doesn't want to come out to you. So they have one identity at home and one identity here at school. But I felt conflicted about not being able to disclose that information to parents as a teacher, especially when it affected students' academics. And that was a very tough position to be in because it's
Wow.
it's not my place. It's not. And I never want to lie to parents and asking me to they were just like, oh, just don't tell them. And I felt very conflicted about that.
And did you feel pressure from your school, like you might be fired if you didn't handle a situation the way they wanted you to? How did all that end up feeling?
So yes, there were other faculty members that left when I did because of all the social emotional learning and the therapy and the mental health aspect. It was a lot of faculty members left because it was no longer about academics. It was about me being a therapist essentially. And I wasn't comfortable with that. And what they were asking, I was like, this is not something that I'm an expert in, and it got to a point where with some students, I felt like I was doing far more harm than good. And I'm very aware of my limitations as a history teacher. And it was just hard to see some of these students really suffering and not getting the help they needed because you shifted the responsibility on the teachers. And that was very difficult to, witness.
Wow. And did you ever feel like students would like weaponize their identities to get teachers in trouble or anything like that?
Yes. If you didn't call student by the right pronouns or name, oh my goodness, you're going to have a lot of problems. And for most of I would say majority of the faculty, it wasn't intentional. It's just hard to one, it's hard to keep up with everyone's pronouns. And I consider myself very open, but I can't keep up with your pronouns and your name, how you identify, teach history, keep up with the objectives and all my other responsibilities. Like it was a lot for me. I'm like, listen, I'm trying to do the best I can. But one thing I disliked was if you did misidentify someone, they would immediately say you're homophobic, you're transphobic. And it's like, no, I'm not. It's like, I just cannot keep up with all of this. I can't keep up with all these different terms, all these different identities. I remember I had a student in class was like, I'm a sapiosexual. I had no idea what that was. I legitimately didn't. So I was like, okay, I'm happy for you. Good on you. And then I remember I wrote that word down so I could go look it up like because I legitimately had no idea. And they were like, how do you not know this term? I'm like, well, I just don't know it. And I was very mindful in my delivery. I was like, oh, that's something I'm not familiar with. And then I also mentioned this isn't necessarily something you bring up in history class, but rather you bring up with the counselor. But I am here to support you in any way that I can. But that's not enough for them. And they're like, oh, you're not respecting my identity. You're just as bad as those who are homophobic and transphobic and all those things. And I was like, no, I'm not familiar with this term and I'm not against it. I just don't know what it is, but give me the opportunity to learn. And a lot of students don't give each other and faculty that grace.
Mm.
Mhm.
Wow. This is like overwhelming to even hear about. I cannot imagine what that would be like to teach in an atmosphere like that because it sounds like you would just be afraid that you're going to step on an invisible landmine at all
Yes.
times.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, there are some students, and this is what I noticed like from Australia to here. I feel like American students, like when we talk about classroom minute, are vicious. There is something wrong with American kids and how they're vicious in how they teach or in how they treat teachers and how they talk to teachers. It feels like there's a war going on and like you're their adversary and you don't even really know what you did, but they are very vicious here in America. And not all kids. There's some kids that are really great, but the ones that are very difficult to deal with, I noticed that, and there's more the malicious intent. I noticed that. Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that might look like on a day-to-day basis?
So once I left that first school, I went to another school that was supposed to have been college prep. It was so I didn't know. So the second school I went to, they didn't disclose this information in the interview. So I didn't know one, they were struggling with enrollment and they were just admitting any and every student that applied. And this school had very limited resources. I remember we didn't have a special education teacher. We didn't even have a library, which I'd never been at a school that didn't have a library. And there was also issues with immaturity. I had a group of sophomores. I have never had a class that was that immature before. And it was it was like I remember like a month into the school year. I'm pretty good at classroom management. I'm kind of laid back. You show up, you do your work. I'll let you do your thing. I'm not gonna, micromanage. But I found like for the first time, I had a seating arrangement. I never do seating arrangements in my class. I let kids sit wherever. So I had a seating chart. I had to write referrals. Before then, I never wrote a referral. Like just never. Because if there was a problem with the student, I could speak with them and they're like, okay, I'll do better. And a simple conversation was enough. I'm like, okay, that's good for me. I don't need to do extra. But with this group, I like writing referrals. I was like, I don't even know how to do this because I just never been in an environment that required that. And they were just so immature and academically in that class they were so far behind. And that's another thing that I never dealt with because I'd been at pretty academically selective college prep schools. So I had been shielded from a lot of the students who can't read, can't write, and all of that discourse that you see that's going on in education now. And I had students who were incredibly gifted and intelligent with kids who couldn't even write a sentence in the same class. And with that comes the behavioral issues. So I never forget, I was in class, I used the word nuance. And like I'm teaching, we're like teaching about the enlightenment, and I used the word nuance. And I had a kid was like, "Are you calling me stupid?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." And I was actually teaching a lesson. I was like, "No." And it's like, "Yeah, you're calling us stupid." I was like, "No, I'm really not." And then the other student was like, "Why do you use big words like that?" And to me, that's just basic academic language. And I just couldn't believe just these are sophomores, by the way. I just couldn't believe the response to me using a word like nuance. And I was in no way, shape, or form calling a kid stupid or saying they were dumb. It came up in my lecture and I used it and they were like, "Yeah, she's calling us stupid." I had students who they were like terrible towards each other. I had students who would ask each other, "How much do you weigh?" I had a student till we were studying World War II. He told his classmate that had red hair, he was like, "The Nazis would kill you." And I legitimately was taken back by that. I was like, "Are you serious?" And it was like those types of behaviors that I had to constantly deal with. And something that I noticed, and this is where admin comes in, admin was so easily manipulated by these kids. It was insane. I've never seen admin that or played like a fiddle, legitimately played like a fiddle. And it wasn't until the second month of school where I learned that there was a certain group of kids at the beginning of the year, they actually made bets with each other and they were trying to see how many teachers they could get to quit before Christmas.
Oh.
And they went as far, they had a Google document and they had a list of all the new teachers and the teachers that they felt were the most vulnerable. And they were keeping track of everything they were doing and saying to teachers in order to get them to quit or get them to cry in class. It was that bad. Yeah. And admin was just like, oh, we've talked to them, we gave them detention, but that's harassment. That's legitimately harassment. And also, we had students. I had this one student, very difficult. So, the year before I got there, the student was actually, they were given detention because they were recording teachers and then they were blackmailing those teachers. Yes. And I didn't know this until it was about 2 months in. I don't know how they forgot to mention that. So, I didn't know this, and I was like, and the student, you try to build the relationships. The student had a reputation, but I was like, "Hey, new year, clean slate." This student was everything they like every other faculty member had said about them. And I was trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, but this student was awful. It just by far the worst student I've ever had. And she was very manipulative. I'm sorry, but I sorry to call a kid a liar. Like their behavior was, to me, was so shocking. Really very shocking because when they're young and they're already playing adults, they're playing admin, they don't like me as their teacher. And like the dean of students was always like, "Oh, I'll just talk to them. I'll just talk to them." But those talks never did anything. And the behavior was terrible. It was really bad. And there was like, we had students who someone pulled the fire alarm in the middle of the school day. I I'm sorry, I couldn't believe it. I was like, "Where are we going?" Someone And they thought it was a joke. We had a student who brought like vegetables to school, like you go to your local grocery store and buy produce. They brought vegetables to school, cut them up, and just threw them in the hallway. And I, as a, t- I just couldn't believe it. I legitimately couldn't, because I think about my time in school. Like my friends and I, we were teenagers, we were mischievous, but we still respected our teacher. We never wanted to get in trouble because I didn't want to deal with my parents. And we would never do such a thing. Like I couldn't even imagine pulling the fire alarm and saying it's a joke. Like it was just wild at the audacity of the kids and how they speak to adults. No, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. They would speak to especially younger looking teachers as if we were friends. I'm like, no, I'm the adult in the room. I'm the authority. You're the child. But I really think the social media component of them not actually interacting face to face, it's why they believe they could talk to adults anyway. Also, email adults any way they want. Like the tone was very disrespectful.
Wow.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of curious, what do you think was the worst part out of all of this? Because there's so many terrible things, it sounds like.
The worst part, I would say, in the classroom for me was differentiation. And I feel like differentiation in theory works, but as a practice, I'm sorry, I do not believe that differentiation works. And I know others would push back on this, but I remember in my government class, I had students who had an SAT score of 700 to students who had SAT scores of 1350 in one class. And a lot of the students were, and this is another thing that shocked me, the coming from a school that's more academic, was I had kids who had no background knowledge, could
Mm.
not read, could not write. And as a secondary education teacher, I felt like I know I wasn't effective a teacher. And I had to deal with the complaints, or your class is hard. I'm like, of course it's hard. You're in 12th grade and you read at a 4th grade level. Like, and the school really was pushing differentiation. There's like, oh, we can just differentiate, we can accommodate kids. And I always felt like I was delusional in some sense, because I'm like, this does not work. It legitimately does not work. And in government class, like I'm teaching how to analyze the Constitution. If you can't read, I'm sorry, I cannot help you, because as a, secondary teacher of 12th graders, I don't teach kids how to read. I don't teach kids how to write sentences. I teach kids how to think critically, analyze, how to put forth arguments and rebuttals, how to use secondary or primary and secondary sources to support their arguments. My classroom structure was like Socratic seminar. So we do readings, you do annotations. It's kind of somewhat like a college classroom. And I'm like, I cannot help you. I'm sorry, but you can't read and write at the 12th grade level, and I am not going to sacrifice the education of the other kids who are on grade level and above because you are not where you're supposed to be. So I definitely got a lot of complaints and pushback from parents about that.
Wow. And I'm curious, did you ever feel gaslighted by administration when you would try to bring some of your observations and concerns to them?
Oh, absolutely. The administration was they would double down on differentiation, and it got to a point where they were like, just dumb it down. And the problem I had was in like the class of 24, I had some kids who were just brilliant. Just really great kids, wanted to learn. They're above grade level. And these are the kids who are definitely going to go to college and succeed. And I felt like we were always sacrificing and or undermining their education because there was so much focus on those kids who were several years behind. And that's something that really bothered me because those parents are paying tuition just like those other kids. And that's something I would clash with admin about that. I really would. And those kids who are lower level, it was to the point where one, I just abandoned differentiation because it's not it wasn't working. And like I said, it might work in some classrooms if they're within a certain range, but I had someone come in, they said I had like 3 different levels. I had like 2nd, 3rd grade, and 4th grade, and then 5th and 6th, and then I had those who were on grade level. So actually 4 different levels in one class. And then I had kids who were on the 11th and 12th grade level. This was all in one class. And I was like, well, how am I supposed to teach this? And a lot of the things they recommended, I'll never forget the woman, she gave me a sheet of paper and it was just a list of differentiation strategies. And that was it. And I was like, okay, so how do I implement this? How do I manage the classroom? I'm just like, how does this work realistically in my classroom? And they just handed me a sheet of paper. I was like, okay, so this obviously isn't going to work. And then I had someone come and observe, and they were like, well, you don't differentiate enough. You know, you put those lower level kids at a disadvantage and all these other things. But I was like, this is not, at one point I was like, this can't be real. I'm sorry, but this legitimately could not be real. And one observer, she's like, do small groups. And okay, I am a true high school teacher through and through. Like, the way my classroom is set up, we have learning pods or we'll do rows because of like the Socratic seminar format. I was like, small and like she's like, small groups. I'm like, what? And because as a high school teacher, that's not something I've ever heard of. And some teachers probably have did it in their classrooms, but coming from the schools that I had been at, that was not a thing. And she was like, oh, you set up small group, like group 1, 2, 3, 4. And even as I'm speaking about her now, I feel like I'm wrong because I just didn't get it. And I was like, "Isn't this elementary?" Like, I legitimately thought it was elementary school because that's what it sounded like to me, and it might be, I don't know. And she's like, "Well, you gotta facilitate and differentiate your instruction for these kids and do this for this group." Mind you, my class period is 50 minutes. And like it takes us 15 minutes just to get started, you know? So you're down to 35 minutes and now you're expecting me to manage all these groups and essentially dumb it down. But then my higher performing kids, something that I noticed, they would get bored. This always happened. They would get bored and they're not really engaged because the curriculum is not rigorous enough. And I know a lot of people don't like that word, but it wasn't. But then I had these lower level kids who were so low academically, they couldn't even do independent work, which as a high school teacher is wild to me. It really is because I'm sorry, I don't teach elementary and middle school for a reason. Like there's a reason why I avoided those grades and that's why. But some kids that were so low, I had to read to them. I had to give them sentence starters. It was a lot. And then within that same class, I had students that had dyslexia and dysgraphia. And I know that's a completely different type of instruction or maybe an intervention. And I didn't even know how to teach them because the readings and the textbook that we use, it was not for those types of kids. And admin was like, oh, you just got to do this. Admin always made it sound like it was just so easy. If you just did X, Y, and Z, you would be fine. Or if you just do these activities, your classroom management would improve. But we could never address the fact that some of those kids did not belong at that school because it was a college prep and they only had one track, college prep track. And it was to the point where they were changing graduation requirements for certain kids because they could not do the math. They could not pass chemistry. They could not pass English or history. So I couldn't even tell you what the graduation requirements were for some of those kids because it was different for every one of them.
So I'm kind of curious, would the kids even attempt to do their work, or were you having issues with kids not even turning in assignments?
Yes, I had a lot of kids that wouldn't do their work. Or and also I dealt with the, oh, your class is so hard. But I don't ever feel like my class was hard. It's just you had to show up and do the work. What I'm now looking back and reflecting, I realized what made my class hard was that I had so many students that were not on grade level. And I will say the way I teach and how I teach history is not for lower level learners. It's not. And I will acknowledge that. And so some students, you battle with AI, but I figured out how to work around that. So what I would do is I would have like in class essays, so they could use their book, they could write out their outline, turn those in. The next day they come back, they write their essay based on their outline. So I did not have to deal with the AI thing. I was like, we're not doing that. Some kids would not do homework at all. Some kids, the quality of their homework. So one thing that really stood out to me, like kids wouldn't know how to capitalize. They could not spell, could not write sentences. You could give them a question like, what is one of the major events in World War II? And they'll just be like, the United States. It's like you could not get complete sentences out of them. The quality of their work was so poor. And you couple that with the lack of background knowledge, the fact that they're not reading on grade level, and it creates all these problems. And I remember one student, they had like their warm up was like a short essay question. They had to write 2 paragraphs. This student couldn't even write a paragraph. I was like, how? Sorry, how are you here? And their parents are like, oh, you run this class like an honors and AP. I'm like, no, your child is so far behind that I cannot accommodate them. And it shows in their work. It does.
Yeah, and it's hard too because if it is a college prep school, I would think that the expectation would be that kids are on grade level, or maybe there's an alternative, maybe special education track where they're getting interventions that's in a tiny group
Mhm.
with other kids at the same grade level. So that just sounds like a no-win situation all around.
It was, and the school we didn't have a special education teacher. We had like a study hall teacher, but you know how study hall teachers are. You just like you show up, you take attendance, the kids do whatever. So one thing I noticed is in order to accommodate the kids, all of the responsibility was on the teachers. And regardless of what administration proposed, it just felt like my workload kept increasing. It legit is I'm like, I have a lot of work. And I would say I'm pretty good at keeping up with my grading. I'm one of those teachers. I do not do work outside of the contract hours. I don't. Like if it doesn't get done in school day, it is what it is. And one trick I learned like my first year, especially if I had like world history, there were weeks where I would not give them any homework and a project, and then I would just catch up on work in other classes. So I was not taking anything home. But I got to a point where I was like, oh, I might have to do work at home, which I'm like, no. But yeah, the workload just kept increasing. And I realized with differentiation, I found it very like it felt like it wasn't sustainable
Mhm.
as a teacher. And I felt like trying to accommodate all the different learning levels and their needs, it felt impossible. And I can easily make lesson plans for my 5 classes in an hour and be done. I'm like, okay, that's great for me. But with differentiation, I feel like I was spending hours trying to get materials, trying to make sure they can read this, trying to read. It was a lot of work. And like I said, this might be something with me and my teaching and not fully understanding what differentiation is and how to implement it in the classroom. But it was just so much work. And I would ask my colleagues, and they're like, no, it's not just you. This is a lot of work. And I feel like differentiation, you need a team. You do.
Well, and I think it would be hard too if the students are not taking ownership of their lower level and if they're not 100% committed to work, probably a few extra hours a night to get caught up. Did
Yes.
you see any kind of ownership among the kids where they were like, I realize I'm behind, I'll do whatever it takes, or did they just not really care?
No, students were always there was always an excuse why they couldn't do their work. But one issue was at that college prep school was that those lower level students, they were behind in all their classes because they could not keep up with the workload. So I had a student that hadn't turned in work in like 2 weeks. And I'm like, we're talking like several zeros in the grade book. And come to find out in biology, they're missing 5 assignments. In algebra, they're missing 6 assignments. And in theology they're missing 10 assignments, and they're missing so many assignments in every class because they cannot keep up. And I'm like, you're missing 8 assignments in my class. But the problem I had was bringing those students in, they can't keep up with the workload, so they're behind in every class. So it's like, as a history teacher, would it be selfish of me to ask for my work when I know they're missing work in every class? And it was a point where certain students they were just suffering. I legitimately felt like they were suffering
Wow.
because they couldn't keep up with the workload.
Would kids like that pass anyway, or did they ever really hold people back?
Oh no. So of course there oh my gosh. So of course you have to exempt them from those assignments. And so it's not a zero. It's just they didn't complete it.
Hmm.
And also admin would ask teachers to change grades. Like, can you take out these 5 zeros? Because I promised their parents they would get out of here with a C. But you haven't did any work in like a month. And then when it came to exams, admin was all over teachers about the difficulty of exams. So if they felt like an exam was too hard, you had to rewrite it. I mean, you can't fail students nowadays. And I would, as a teacher, I never want to fail a student, but I feel like we're at a point where it's gotten out of control, and just passing students along from one grade to a next and I think about society, we're going to have a group of kids in 5 to 10 years that are functionally illiterate or functionally literate. And these kids are just getting passed on year after year and they're not learning. And that's something that really stood out to me.
Wow. So I'm curious about the differences between the kids in America versus in Australia and the school systems. You could just tell us whatever we should know about the differences.
So I would say in Australia, it has a lot to do with their society. They have access, and it's not perfect, but they have access to resources. They have access to programs, and there's more investment in society for the average person. And the kids were very well, and that's another thing. The kids are very well rounded. And there's a focus on global citizenship where they understand that they are a part of a world, and that it's not just all about Australia. It's about how they exist in the world and how they show up as contributing members of society. But back to the programs, I felt like all those schools, there always felt like, even at the public schools, there was always so many programs for all these kids. And then with for example, like their sports system, just about every kid could participate in a sport. And they did not have to pay thousands of dollars to play basketball or soccer or whatever sport. They could play recreationally or they could play at the club level, but there was funding and there was investment. So you had you had a lot of kids who could find an after school program and participate, whether it's music or art. Whereas here in America, everything comes with a price tag. It's very hard to access. And I would say my issue with the United States is, one, we are not the best country in the world. Like we're not. And I know a lot of people will push back on that, but we're not. And this idea that somehow we're superior to other people as Americans, that's something I don't understand. Anti-intellectualism is ruining American society. And I see that in education because, how kids show up or how they don't show up. But also what really stood out to me with like here in America is the lack of programs. Truly the lack of programs for like the average kid, maybe the low income kid. It just here is not accessible. And so I feel like there's a lot of kids that are falling through the gaps.
And I'm really curious about the differences in behavior with Australian kids versus American kids. How do they treat their teachers?
So, I mean, there are some schools in Australia where the kids are rough or
Mhm.
rowdy, however you want to say it. But for the most part, I would say they're respectful, but also every school there, and this is another thing I come back to, every school there has uniforms. And it truly makes a difference. And I know people are like, oh, what you wear shouldn't make a difference, but it does. It eliminates so many problems. Whereas here in America, it's like the kids are like, "What are you wearing? What name brand? What socioeconomic class you're in?" It's just like it's just so different. And here in America, once again, it's about managing behavior, whereas in Australia, it's about academics, and that's the biggest difference.
And do you see the same kind of educational philosophies and pop culture trends in Australia? Or are they kind of a few years lagging behind the crazy stuff that's happening in America?
So there are some trends that are taking place there, but I feel like with Australian society, they are not as polarized. And in a way, they're very mindful about how they educate their kids. Also the fact that it's a multicultural society, so you have so many kids in people from all around the world. That multiculturalism shows up in the classroom, and there's more investment in education. So they're really committed to just educating their kids. And I would say they're not behind. In some ways, I think they're ahead because they aren't implementing a lot of these trends or these buzzwords into their classrooms, into their curriculum in their school as an institution. Whereas here in America, it's always the extreme, and that's something I noticed.
Interesting. So it sounds like you didn't deal with a lot of the same propensity for kids to label themselves and say, I have these 15 disabilities and I'm a part of this exotic group over here. That just wasn't really a factor in Australia.
No, it wasn't. No, it really was. And also with uniforms, you can't tell. So I'm not saying there were kids that weren't like that, but that's not how they showed up in the classroom. So I would never know. Mhm.
Interesting. So it really sounds super refreshing and simple. Academics is about academics in Australia. Then you get to America and it seems like it's about everything except for academics.
Yes, yes. But I noticed academically, the Australian kids were they were ahead.
Mm.
With like their reading, their writing, and how well-rounded they are. I just felt like they were just ahead of American kids. Even the average student in Australia, I feel like is 2 to 3 grade levels ahead of the average kid here in America.
So, if you could import something from Australia into American education, where would you even begin trying to talk to admin about what's wrong and compared to the rest of the world, what we're missing?
I would say, one, let's stop chasing these trends, these educational philosophies, and these buzzwords. Like that's what I would tell them. Also with like the different learning levels, bring back tracking. And I know that has a negative connotation, but bring back tracking or at least flexible tracking because a lot of kids do not belong in the same classroom. So really just get back to the academics. That's what I would say. Stop with the buzzwords and the trends. I felt like with teaching in America, every time a new trend will pop up, there's like, oh, we have to implement it in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's going to actually work. So just like focus on the academics, focus on the teaching and the outcomes and student growth and development and not these trends and buzzwords. That's one thing I dislike about American education. Every time there's a new word out there, somehow, some way it has to be implemented in the classroom or a new behavioral management system. And it's exhausting.
Well, I'm curious what ended up being the final straw for you where you're like, I'm not even going to finish this year. I am done, done, done. What happened?
So what was the final straw was I had this class of a freshman class at 2 periods, and the learning levels were all over the place. To the behavioral issues, and I just felt like admin was coming down hard on teachers and trying to make us responsible for everything. And I one thing I do not like is dumbing down the curriculum. I cannot stand that. And with that world history class, I will admit I did not enjoy teaching them because it wasn't even it was basically they had basically turned it into a remedial history class.
Mm.
And let's do a little bit of reading. We'll do writing sentences. It was not a high school history class. And also, I felt like my higher performing students, I felt like we were undermining their education, and it's just something that I could not stand. I really couldn't, because those are the kids who I knew if I could pour more into them, teach in the way that I'm used to, they could easily be successful and get what they need out of my history course. But I just like it was hard to watch them dumb it down, and then these kids are just bored, just legitimately bored, because I had like some my high flying students, even though they were freshmen, they could easily have been in a sophomore advanced class. Like they were very bright kids, but they're in a class with kids who can't even read. They're in classes with kids who can't write. I'll never forget, like, us teachers were trying to make a proposal to admin. Well, can we make a remedial history class and kind of separate them? They didn't want to do that. They were just like differentiate and accommodate. And they kept pushing differentiation. And I was like, you know what? I'm out. I'm like, it's not worth it anymore. I wasn't enjoying teaching history, and I wanted to pour more into those higher performing kids, and I couldn't. And that's just something that did not sit well with me.
Wow. And what was the role of instructional coaches? Were they any nicer, or were they just as unhelpful as admin?
So I felt like they weren't helpful because they were also pushing differentiation, but we didn't have any resources or the personnel. And I truly felt like we could not accommodate the kids they were admitting. We really couldn't. And some of these kids, well, it's different with private school. They have students with 504s and IEPs, but it's not like public school where you have to honor that. And so as a teacher, I will admit I was pretty pissed that I had all these kids with IEPs in one classroom, and we did not have the personnel to support them. But yet I'm expected to accommodate all of these kids, lower learning levels. And some of these kids, from what they would tell me, they had some pretty lengthy IEPs. I never had access to them. I was like, I can't accommodate you. Like, one student was telling me their accommodations from their previous public school. It was like my teacher wouldn't write and read. I had to sit near the teacher. They would give me a different set of notes. I was like, no, no, I'm not doing it. And I hope I don't sound or come off as insensitive. I was like, I'm not doing that. And as a teacher, that's something you do with a team. So I have been in environments where, like the previous school, I worked with a special education teacher. We had an interventionist, also work with a librarian and the ESL teacher. So all five of us would work with curriculum together, and it worked flawlessly. Like, we were always in step with each other. We would send each other assessments. I was like, hey, how can I do better to accommodate this student? So it's not like I'm against it. It's just I realized as I was one person trying to do the job of five people. And that's when I was like, I'm out. This is not fun for me. And the workload, I was like, yep, this is not happening.
And I'm kind of curious, what kind of personal impacts did being in such a difficult environment have on you? Did it hurt your mental health? Did it stress you out? What was that like?
You know, it didn't really stress me out. So I'm a very low key and easygoing person. It was to the point where I was just like, if I don't finish something at school, I'm not taking anything home. So I told my kids, don't email me after 5:30. I'm not, well, okay, with the exception of my AP government class. But other than that, I was like, don't email me after 5:30. I got to a point where I was not given homework. Only class I was giving homework and tests for was for my AP class, because they have the exam at the end of the year. But all my other classes, I was given legitimately one assignment a week, and it was due on Friday at like midnight. Like, I was not giving any work. They would show up, we would have our lecture, or we would have classes and whatnot. It was like so easy. I was just giving out A's. Write a little 3 sentences. Okay, here goes your A. I was not invested. And I felt bad because I know that's not right for the kids. But considering the situation, that was how I was, preserving myself. And And like I said, I was just coasting, except for my AP government class. Now, I will say that was the only class that I would bring work home for, so they can be prepared for their AP exam. But my other 5 classes, no, nothing. So it's not like I wasn't stressed about it. I was just like, huh, it is what it is, and very easygoing. But I do know some of my colleagues, their mental health was heavily impacted. I do know some of my colleagues were very stressed out, and you could see it on their faces in like faculty meetings. Some of my colleagues were like, "How are you dealing with this?" I was like, "One assignment a week. Like, just do whatever you have to do in order to keep your sanity and make it." And there was one colleague I truly felt for her. She left before I did. She had a rowdy 7th period, and they were terrible to her. Like, she was right across the hall from me, and I would hear her, and she was not someone to yell, but she legitimately had to yell at her kids, bring in the dean of students, and she left before I did. I mean, I left in December. She left like at the beginning of October. So we hadn't even been in school for a full month or a full 6 weeks at that point. She was just like, I'm out. And I truly felt for her. I really did, because she was a really great teacher, someone I enjoyed working with, and she was like, I'm gone. I'm gone. I was like, oh, okay, you beat me to it. Because at that point I was thinking about leaving, but yeah, she left. Mhm.
Now, this is a random question that just came to mind, but I'm curious, in your personal opinion, do you think admin knows the truth of the disaster atmosphere they're creating and they just don't care? Or do you think that they're genuinely Pollyanna optimists that are just living on another planet entirely and totally out of touch with the reality of just how bad things are for teachers?
So I feel like admin was a bit of both.
Mm.
One, out of touch, and I tread carefully because I never want to disrespect the admin, and I understand the work and the years they put in education to get to that point. So I want to be very mindful about how I speak about them. But one, very much out of touch and not understanding the type of students that they were bringing in with the curriculum that we had and the expectations. But also, they were in a position where they couldn't really do much because due to lack of funding, even though this is a private school, there was a lack of funding. They didn't have the resources. So their hands were tied in a lot of ways. And I try to be mindful of that. But also felt that if you know you have limited resources, you cannot bring in kids with all of these learning disabilities and differences and put that pressure on your staff. And there were times I would headbutt with admin. Like, I had one admin, he told me I was very callous with my expectations. So with the class, they had one assignment a week and it was due on Friday. Legitimately, that's it. And it wasn't even due like at the end of the school day at midnight. And the thing is, I was at a point where I was coasting. I didn't even check. So kids could turn it in by Sunday at midnight because I wouldn't grade until that following Monday until I went back to school. So they had legitimately over a week to do these assignments. And this student didn't turn it in, and I gave them a 0. And the admin really came down hard on me. And I was like, you know what? This is not worth it. It was like, it was one of, that was one of several moments where like, this is not worth it. And then also with observations, which I absolutely hated. I hated observations.
Tell us more about the observations.
So well, I'm trying to think. It's called the Marzano teaching evaluation, and it was the first year they implemented it. And I felt like one, it was just checking boxes. And something that I didn't like was before the observation, so the pre-meeting, I would tell the observer, like, hey, these kids, this is how they're going to act. Like, I'm just going to tell you now, this is how they're going to act. This group is very low. This group is high. This is what I'm going to try to do. I'll try my best. And I always felt like admin with the observations were very critical of teachers and always framed it as we were not doing enough to help those kids, but the kids could never be held accountable. And I'll never forget on one observation, we were having a debate, and the observer put like one kid made an inappropriate joke to another kid, and I've talked to them about that several times, had the dean of students involved, and I told them they're going to say this and this is how they're going to react. And then on the feedback was like, student made inappropriate joke and teacher didn't do anything to stop it. And I was very irritated by that because I told you what was going to happen. It did. I've explained to you how I've tried to deal with this and how this is a behavior that continues to happen, and admin is not in a position to stop it, and neither am I. And I was very mindful because I don't want kids to bully each other, but it got to a point where I was like, hey, you can't say that. We would have conversations about how to talk to each other. Things that were appropriate and inappropriate. So it's like I'm actively trying to get these students to a point where they can at least have some respect for their peers, and they just don't care. But they would put that on the evaluation. Another area that I always failed in was differentiation. Always differentiation. And it like they were like, "Oh, teacher didn't differentiate their instruction." I'm like, I told you what it was going to be. And so that I felt like the observations were not helpful, but considering the type of students we had, it just felt like it was unnecessary, because if you're going to load up my classroom with students with IEPs, 504s, and all these different learning levels, I'm sorry, I don't want to be observed, because this is a classroom environment in which I know I'm not reaching every student. I know there are problems, and I've asked for assistance and help, but you're not in a position to do anything about it.
And I know that you work with high school, so your interactions with parents might have been a bit less than maybe elementary or middle. But does anything come to mind when you think about what you saw with like parenting culture or just with your students' parents?
So it seemed like there's a disconnect. I had a student that was like 4 years behind, and their parents had no idea. And I legitimately could not understand how you didn't know. I just couldn't. And when you talk to parents, it's like, oh, well, they've been getting A's all this time, but also they've been passing them along. And so I just never understood how parents just don't know, legitimately don't know. Or like I had a student that was missing several assignments. They ended up failing my class. The parent was like, I didn't know. We have a platform where parents can check their grades. How did you not know? That's another. I just legitimately like, where have you been the whole school year? And it's the lack. I mean, parents not being present, and parents not being involved with their kids in their education.
One thing I forgot to ask you earlier was your opinion on cell phones in the classroom. How did that work in America versus Australia?
So luckily, I was at a school, they did have a no cell phone policy. That was
Oh,
something
okay.
that they did really well. So I didn't have to deal with it. And so I fully support a no cell phone policy. I'm sorry, cell phones create a lot of problems, and they actually implemented that policy at the school because the year before they had students recording other students unknowingly, and also teachers, and then they were sending out these videos. There was a bullying incident, and so they're just like no phones. So luckily I haven't had to deal with that. And that's something I really really enjoy, because I don't want to get into the back and forth of please put your phone up. I don't have the bandwidth. I just want to teach, and I'm not gonna not fight a kid. I'm just not gonna go back and forth over a phone. And I know with some kids, if you were to take their device, you're gonna have some problems. And I just don't want to deal with it. I really don't.
Definitely. Well, one question that I love to ask people is if you had a magic wand and you could change anything in education, what would you change?
I would say tracking, and and separating students by their ability. That would be the biggest one, because a lot of students aren't being reached because they're in classrooms with all these different learning levels. And I think asking a teacher to teach 5 different lessons in one period, that's never going to happen. No other profession is responsible for like a dentist. If you go to the dentist with a cavity, that's a you problem. It's not your dentist. You're not going to go to your local mechanic for a set of braces. So it's like I wish that we would bring back tracking, ability grouping, and also I know this is controversial, especially as we kind of come out of the No Child Left Behind era, but some kids need to be held back. Some they really do, because once you get to my class at the 11th and 12th grade level, if you're that far behind as a secondary teacher, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. I really can't, because my curriculum is not for kids on a second, third, and fourth grade level. It's for high school students. I would not teach imperialism to a second grader. So, and because they don't have that understanding. So definitely bring back the holding kids back. Also, some kids need to fail. I'm sorry, some kids legitimately need to fail a class and retake it, because passing them along is not going to help them. And if they get to college, that's just going to be more problems for the professor. And that's unfair.
Definitely.
Mhm.
Well, I'm kind of curious what you want to do in the future in terms of education, because it sounds like you had a really good experience in Australia,
Mhm.
not the best in America. What are your thoughts about just the future of education in your personal life?
So I'm looking at international schools. I love international schools. I love the diversity. I love the curriculum and just like what all the students bring. So I'll look at some international schools. We're planning on moving abroad in a few years, so that's on the table. If I don't go that route, I want to work with like international organizations, potentially an NGO, look at education and human rights. I'm not sure what country or what region. And also, I'm not sure how I'm going to break into that. I'm trying to figure that out now, but I'm in this degree program, so I'm on the right track. But definitely something with an international setting. I know I will never teach in a public school. I probably only stick with independent schools if I do go back to teaching. But I think for me, I definitely want to be in an international setting, because that's where I started, and that's where, like I said, I had success, and that's where I really enjoyed education. Like, I felt like when I was abroad, yes, education is hard, but the positives truly outweighed the negative, and I was excited to go to class. I was excited to teach my students, and they wanted to be there. I was excited about the curriculum. And yes, there were some bad days, and it's never perfect, but it felt like it was worth it. And you're like, okay, this is a career that I could see myself in for 10 to 15, potentially retire in. I haven't felt that since I've come back to America. So I definitely want to be in an environment where I can have some of those same feelings, because I do miss education. I do miss teaching history to high school students. And I do miss those days, like those aha moments, or we do a project. I do miss that. But I just haven't found that here in America. And it's not to say that I won't, but it's been very challenging since I've come back.
Definitely. Well, the last question I'll ask is, are you happier now that you left American teaching?
I am. I am. Yes, I am happier because I'm not as stressed or dealing with the workload and the constant criticism and the disrespect. Some of my close friends have also left education, and I feel like Education America is in crisis mode. I've known so many teachers in the past 2 years that have left, and some of them are like, absolutely not. And I'm not even talking about like the younger teachers. I'm talking about teachers who thought they were going to retire and who have been in education for 10, 15 years, some of them 20, and like, we're out. Some of them have went on, they transitioned to other careers in degree programs. So yes, I feel better. And then like once I told my close friends I was leaving, they was like, finally, like you're joining the club. But like I said, I am concerned because I know so many teachers that have left and so many that are planning to leave. And they don't want to go back in any educational setting. And they're just like, I'm done. Especially the veteran teachers, the ones that mentored me, seeing them leave was devastating. It really was, because those are the ones who, guide the younger teachers. They want you to stay in the profession, and seeing them leave it's truly heartbreaking, because that's where the experience and the knowledge is coming from. And like at my last school, we had so many teachers that hadn't even been in teaching for 5 years. It was like 2 years, 3 years, and all there were no veterans. They had just all left, which is to me very alarming.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for being so honest. I think your experiences will resonate with so many teachers. And
Mhm.
audience, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to share your story with me, feel free to email me at teachertherapytrish@gmail.com. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.